But I will be live by the time it is 11, which is now. So cool. Well timed. So hey, here we are again, doing a live stream. I got a bunch of weird stuff to do today. I'm going to be playing with various things today, whether or not anybody joins me on this live stream. Although I am, of course, still available for answering questions about plugins and things. Because it's one of the primary reasons I'm here, but I'm also here doing stuff, waiting to see people turn up. And I can pull this out a little bit so that I get a bit of a monitor as to when anybody shows up. And what I'm currently doing is looking around at various things on the internet. One of them is muffwiggler.com, and I'm looking at an adorable little picture of a sort of micro sloth. A sloth is a low-frequency modulator, and I've got a triple sloth in the Eurorack system. The fellow who makes them is also making like 1/3 rack unit, or something like 2 rack unit for the 1U format. So what you get is in the way that kind of works out, you can do Eurorack in the normal sense, but you can also do Eurorack with these little skinny sets of panels that basically all they're much less deep, as it were. They're just little tiny modules, and they're utility devices. So he has put together a sloth that is this adorable little thing about the size of 2 Eurorack jacks, and a PCB that goes backwards from that, and it generates a sloth LFO output. I'm not sure whether it's generating in and out of phase, because that can be useful. I've played with that sometimes. The sloths that I've got have a X, Y, and Z output, as well as some combined outputs and inputs that let you sort of prod it around a little bit. And the X output is normal. It's one aspect of the chaotic oscillator thing that they have. The Y output is another aspect of it, and the Z output is inverted Y output. So sometimes what I'll find I'm doing is using that as an LFO, and then taking the Z output, which I know is the inverse, and patching that to something, knowing that with this really slow oscillator, the one voltage is going to go in a direction, and then the other voltage is going to be its counterpart. It's going to do the opposite thing. So I can patch that to stuff, and that can be very useful. I think it's foolish of me to have this in a separate channel, because if folks show up, I can just sort of see them show up when they talk. So essentially, on the one hand, I'm having my coffee, a second cup, so I'll be talking really fast by the end of this live stream. It's real hot. And I'm looking at this adorable little micro sloth circuit, and also looking at some of my parts, which I can show you. I mentioned in the release of podcast that it allowed me to get 1,000 LEDs. If you'd like to know what 1,000 LEDs look like, I can show you. 1,000 LEDs looks like this, and 100 LEDs looks like this. These are what's called T1 size, if I'm not mistaken. I think it actually says on here. Okay, maybe it doesn't say on here. Oh, no, it does. This is. So these are T1 size. They're the smallest size and the least bright. And they'll also pull the least current, which I care about with making circuits because I'd like to have lots of blinking lights everywhere, but I don't want them to impede the ability of the circuit to function. And I can build some of my sequencer ideas and just tack yellow LEDs onto the outputs of everywhere that there's a switch or something. So it just sort of rides on the back of that thing. Where there's a voltage there, it will light up, and it'll show you where the inside state of the circuit is. It'll be this little yellow light. Possibly the top one will be red just to sort of highlight the fact that it's different. And it'll just be cycling through at the speed of whatever the sequence is. Now, the other thing that I'm doing today, which has me quite engaged with this concept, is since I'm making these circuits with LFOs and stuff, and I've got a lot of different parts. Hey, Bo, you didn't miss much. I'm just sort of talking through my initial stuff. If you missed me showing the LEDs, I got 1,000 LEDs, and this is what 1,000 LEDs looks like. They are 2-cent LEDs. I got them from All Electronics. You can see their packaging there. And these ones, there's 100 of them because they were like 7 cent or something. And I've also got these ones. Here's my other LED package. And these guys seem to be poking out the bottom of this. There's only 10 of these because they are ultra bright LEDs, and they cost me like 50 cents each. So I couldn't get 1,000 of them. 1,000, 50 cents each would be $500. I can't throw that around right now. 1,000 2-cent LEDs is $20. I was able to do that. Yep, these were 2 cents a pop. Still are. You can still get them. All Electronics, just look for the cheapest possible ones, and very reasonable. And it's basically about as good as getting them from somewhere like Alibaba, except for that All Electronics orders these things and then has them in their warehouse so that if they're all screwed up or whatever, they'll probably sell them for like 1/10 of a cent. They'll probably still sell them, but that way you know they've ordered a huge quantity of these things in and are reselling them at like 2 cents each or so. And so people will have a sense of like what they are, and you know what that particular order was. You know, the yellow ones, again, are basically like some kind of overstock situation, or they just had an opportunity to buy a container full of electronic parts or whatever. And so they're T1, so they will fit onto perf board like I use. And I am absolutely hoping to use these for making some stuff up. And the reds are simply a different color for the same purpose. And I'd have 1,000 of them too, except for that they were about 2 or 3 times the price of the ultra cheap ones. So I passed on that for the time being. I just got 100, which will definitely hold me for immediate intentions. And again, these are for a different purpose because these are for making Vactrols. And there's something that's worth knowing about that too. Vactrols are made out of stuff like this. The label on this doesn't matter so much, although I think actually it's still relevant. This is not a 5-pack. I've got about 50 of them in here. But you can get photocells, which are these kinds of things. Like these are tiny little ones. These ones are kind of larger. They're a material called cadmium sulfide, and it's in this little S-shaped channel between 2 electrical connections. And these are some even larger ones, of which I don't have that many. And then, when my dad passed away, I looked through some of his stuff, and he had photocells too, and these are antique photocells. I don't know whether that means they will sound good or bad or better or different, but what you do to make photocells work is you can patch this like right between a signal of some kind, like a voltage. Oh, I could make an optocompressor. Some kind of signal and the output. Just put this like it was your guitar cable. And what a photocell will do is, if it doesn't have any light shining on it, it'll be very high resistance. Like I've got these guys, which look very similar to the other ones. And these are 10 megohm in darkness. If you completely cover them and make them be totally dark, like wrap them up in electrical tape, they're going to block signal. 10 megohms is a lot. That's enough so that if you're patching your guitar through it, if it's dark, you won't hear anything. Patch your Eurorack synthesizer through it, you won't hear anything. And then if you shine a bright light on it, how bright depends, but you shine a light on it, and it'll go to 130 ohms, or these ones will, which is very low, and you could patch a guitar through that or whatever, and you'll immediately hear the result. It goes from basically a switch being off to a switch being on, because the resistance of the off state is really quite high. The resistance at the off state is like there's no connection. It's like the amount of resistance on the plastic that's part of the jack that you've got. And then the resistance at the on state is not quite as low as a bare wire, but it's pretty low. And they're sensitive to light, which is where our LEDs come in. Now I have the large number of these little indicator ones, but in order to make a CDS cell go to a low resistance so that you can get signal through it, you need a brighter light than these, because these are just tiny and very low power. So these are my 50-cent, I just got 10 of them. The 50-cent LEDs, also from All Electronics, because I like those guys. And they are what's known as ultra bright LEDs, and they're red. Now CDS cells are sensitive to different colors, and in particular the way they're built, they'll tend to be sensitive to mostly like yellow or amber, stuff like that. So I have spent some time looking for like, how can I find a very bright yellow LED so that it will be most efficient to drive a CDS cell. And it turns out I was wrong about that. That was not actually what you want to do for this reason. Different colors of LED have different sort of maximum brightnesses available. Like you can get an ultra bright yellow LED, and the CDS cell, the photocell, will be like 100% effective at that frequency. And it'll go to like 7,000 microcandle power or whatever. There's a rating for that kind of stuff. So think 7,000 at 100% for the brightest yellow that you can get. And you think like, cool, that's 100%, that's excellent. And red is only like 70%. That seems much worse, except for at the same voltage, red will do like 40,000 microcandle power just because LEDs are more efficient as red. And the yellow ones just can't come up with the brightness for the same amount of energy. So essentially the answer there is it's all very well to know what frequencies the cell wants to respond to, but you're just as well off finding a way of blasting it with light at whatever color. And red is a very suitable choice for that because red LEDs are a lot more efficient than other colors of LEDs, possibly even white ones. I'm not absolutely certain. And the fancy color ones will cost you more. So these like ultra hyper bright red LEDs are exactly the kind of thing that I would want, because the whole thing about it is, you've got, what am I doing with this? I'm using this for something else. Let me get my marker out. I've got the wonderful Tombow ABT marker, which means it does not have stinky fumes, and I can draw with it without doing myself any damage, which is always useful. Then you got your photocell. So the way a Vactrol works is your light-emitting diode is shining light on the photocell, and you can basically have your input coming into the photocell, and it'll only pass through if there's light on it. You seal it up. What I like to do when making these, especially when I'm making them like I want it to be extremely efficient at turning the photocell basically to a straight wire. So I just want to blast it with all the light I possibly can. And you can do fun things like you could have two of them and blast them with the same light thing, and it'll work perfectly well. This guy that was doing the sloth circuits has done some cool stuff with strange circuits that modulate a LED, and then there's like 5 photocells around it. So the one light varies all of the different resistances there. So what I like to do is glue the tip of the LED to the face of the photocell, and then basically wrap white paper, like I'll rip paper off. I'll wrap white paper around that, and then wrap black electrical tape around that, so that the inside, where it's supposed to get bright, is surrounded by white paper, and we'll just let it get more effectively bright, because it'll be a big reflector. The reason I'm not doing something like a mirror or a piece of aluminum tape, like aluminum ducting tape, which is a great technology for hacking with stuff, or tinfoil, is that those are conductors. So I'd have to go to extra trouble to make sure that it doesn't touch any of the leads, because it would just short stuff out, which is no good. So I just as soon use white paper, because white paper is not a conductor at all. And as such, I can get kind of the same effect, maybe not quite as efficient, but I can get the light bouncing around in there. Oh, all of the hardware, Bo. Here's the thing. You can make a mixer out of a series of these, and it's a voltage-controlled mixer because it's controlling the resistance of it. You could do this, which is I haven't tried this one yet, but this is your ground, and this is your hot, so this becomes like a guitar cable or something. And you say, you go in here, it doesn't actually matter which direction you go, because it'll work the same either way. It's like wiring everything together. I haven't tried this out, but in theory, you can have a pair of diodes, and they're back-to-back, meaning that they can always pass electricity no matter whether you're positive or negative voltage. And this orientation of diodes is clipper diodes. This is like a stomp box. So if you have the clipper diodes and you run a signal through it, it can even be as low as a guitar level signal, but it'll certainly work for Eurorack stuff. Then quiet stuff is subtle enough that it's not going to be lighting up the diodes. And then the harder you hit the guitar, the brighter those will light, which then affects the CDS cell, which is set up to short to ground. So this becomes a thing where this is a distortion/compressor in 3 parts with no resistors or other parts. You could put this in a jack if you had tiny enough parts, like a large enough thing or whatever. And rather than just only doing a distortion, because if you listen to the output of the photocells wired up this way and you didn't have this, it would just sound like a fuzzbox. When the voltage starts coming through, it starts lighting up the photocell, it starts lighting up the LEDs, and with regular diodes, it just lets the voltage through to ground. And what's left over goes like this. This is what's coming in. And then when the diodes kick in, it starts using up the energy here and here. And you've got a distortion on the output. So that's a way of doing a analog distortion. Excuse me. But wait, there's more. Remember that we had the CDSL here. So if you had the cell there and it's shorting this to ground, it's going to remove this again. So if this was just engaging, it would turn this down as soon as this was there. As soon as it was underneath this point, it would go dark, which would mean that the cell would go up again, which would mean that it would take away the distortion factor. And it'll start lighting up the cell at the diode threshold. The diode threshold could be anything. There's no telling. It's something like, I'm not sure whether it's a Schottky or... There's a kind of diode where it engages way past the threshold. But I think there's a lot of diodes that are, it'll depend upon the diode if I'm not mistaken. They're not all going to be the same exact threshold, but they're all going to be a little more than 0. So basically this is a soft clip or a compressor depending upon how slowly this cell reacts, how slowly it bounces back. And you can get different cells with different speeds of bouncing back. That's one of the reasons you get situations like, what am I even looking at? That goes there. You can get situations of like, here's a bag of 1.5 billion CDS cells and they're each 2 cents. Or like this one, this is a good example. These guys were like originally a 5-pack and they were real cheap. They were down around like under 10 cents each. And sometimes the reason for that is somebody went and bought a enormous pile and painstakingly went through with a calibrated light or like was measuring how fast they sprang back and picked out just the best ones for, say, an optocompressor, and basically threw away all the rest. And you get the ones that were thrown away. So if you can say, let's just say that one of the criterion that they might have used is we're going to throw them away if it doesn't spring back to its high resistance state slowly. Because for an optocompressor, you might very well want to especially pick out a CDS cell that, gets to low resistance relatively slowly. You hit it with a bunch of light and it's going to respond. But some of them, like I think these guys, these tiniest ones, have a tendency of reacting really fast. And then when you shut off the light, they go back to a high resistance really fast. That's not necessarily what you want for an optocompressor. That said, with inside my reverb, I'm using a CDS cell for exactly the same type of purpose. And it is set up so that it fakes having a slower reaction. Because the cell initially didn't. Like I've got it set up so that I've got the back-to-back diode so I can just run a signal into it and it'll flash the cells with light, and I've got the cells set up to do essentially this. I've got them set up as a sidechainer. So on the output of the reverb, I've got a couple of these across it, and if you flash light on there, it'll damp down the output. So it all depends upon how it reacts to the light, and the cells that I used are so quick to react that if you just use the raw diodes, it sounds like a crazy distortion. It sounds like you're frequency modulating or amplitude modulating the output of the reverb directly with the waveform that you're driving it with. And that doesn't give you a sidechaining effect. It doesn't crunch it down and then slowly come back up. So what I ended up doing there with that circuit was this. I've got the input, I've got the back-to-back diodes because I'm trying to make it engage no matter what, whether it's positive or negative voltage. And then this is against ground, and the cell also connects to ground. So the hot is here, it's like from over here. So I got this thing, and if I'm not mistaken, this guy connects to ground as well, but I've also got this going on. And the interesting thing is when you do this kind of stuff, you can also use other little diodes just to generally be like, you can get voltage in here, but then you can't get it out unless it dissipates in a normal way. I got a big old capacitor between the output of the diodes and ground. So what happens is, if this is a huge enough capacitor, the rectified circuit, I got a waveform coming in here, and once you get out the end of this, it is making a light for each of these. Like there's a light for this positive waveform, and then there's a light for the negative waveform, and it's just using it most efficiently. It's powering up this capacitor. And actually, you know something? I'm misleading you and telling you terrible, terrible lies, because what I need to do is explain it in a different way. Here's what's really happening. What's really happening is these are just regular old diodes. They're little signal diodes. These tiny, tiny little things, you can barely see them. Like if you thought 1,000 things in here was impressively small for the parts, like 1,000 diodes doesn't even fill up all of this. They can be super tiny. And those are feeding the light emitting diode. Actually, the connection goes here. So that, yeah, I know I'm being bad. So it's only positive at this point. And then there's a capacitor, so it has to fill the capacitor with energy first. But it's also draining through the other diode. And I only need one in this context. It's draining through the other diode to ground. So you try to fill up the capacitor, even though the diode is basically bleeding it all off to ground as fast as you can fill it in. And you could put a resistor in there, basically here, to slow that down, which sometimes it's a good idea. But the point being, at this point, it doesn't have to be a fast reacting cadmium sulfide cell. It could be one of the crazy slow one. I mean, it can be one of the slow it doesn't have to be a slow reacting cell. Because essentially, the situation with that becomes like this. You want to be hitting it with voltage, and then the resistance that it makes goes to a very small resistance up here, and then slowly tails off. And that's what gives you this sort of a sidechaining effect, where you hit the setup with a burst of noise, and then the amplitude of the reverb or whatever comes back up steadily. Or ideally, you have it come back up real slowly. And if you have one of these tiny little cells that you can get for insanely cheaply, it's going to act like this. You're going to make it go to a very low resistance when you hit it with a bunch of light, and then it's going to instantly go back again. So it doesn't sound like you want, and you also can't do an optocompressor just using these in the simplest circuit. But what you can do is this weird conglomeration where it's like, okay, if we hit a bunch of energy coming through here, we're filling up a capacitor. The diode, the light emitting diode, can only drain so fast. So you balance that out so that it still lights up, but lights up bright enough that you can make it do what you want. And then you've got a capacitor driving it. So you're filling it up. It's probably a lot of power drain initially, filling the capacitor and lighting up. And then the capacitor drains through the light emitting diode, and that makes it slowly drain down. And it fakes having one of the special fancy photocells that people go through large numbers of them in order to pick out. Now, it might actually sound slightly different. I'm not exactly sure whether there's total benefits having to do with the really slow ones. Probably I'll have to find a really slow one and compare it, which is easy enough to do. I can check that out and see whether there's anything interesting there, and then put it into a plugin, of course. But the neat part about this is that this is how you get Vactrols that work like regular Vactrols with a relatively small amount of parts. You need 2 of the super small diodes and a capacitor, which needs to be fairly large. We're talking like 100,000, more than 1,000 microfarads, just to keep the diode lit for this long. It needs to act like a battery. So you have it set up like that. Also, the really large capacitors won't necessarily charge up instantly. So the capacitor is going to try to do this. And that'll change the way that it behaves too. But the important thing there is that when making this kind of crazy stuff, it's not about doing exactly the thing, like that there's only one way to make an opto isolator or an opto compressor. It's once you know how you can make it go slower or faster or change the lights in different ways, it's possible to just do weird stuff and like, okay, let me solder on a couple of resistors and a capacitor and a diode here and there and this and that and the other thing. And that lets you do much more interesting things. So that's part of what I'm setting up to do at the moment is getting my parts ready, getting these parts ready, getting ready to experiment with some of those opto isolators and things, because there's stuff that I do, such as the transformer thing that's part of my kick drum setup now. I'm pointing over towards it, where you take an envelope and you patch it into the transformer, and then since the transformer can't actually pass DC, what you get is an initial voltage spike. And I can patch that into a VCA, and I basically just reshaped my voltage. I've reshaped the thing. And when you're doing that, you'll get different results based on like what size of transformer you use. And that has also got all kinds of things. And the thing about it is, if you needed to get like, oh, I need a power transformer for a high watt amplifier, that's hundreds of dollars. No news on the half-wave sine wave thingy yet, not yet. I will fill you in on some stuff that's happening recently, at least in general terms, because it's been there's been some challenges lately. Not specifically happening to me, but kind of. But yeah, here what I was saying is if you had, say, a big old square wave, and you patch the square wave into a frequency modulation input, patch it into FM and something else, then you're getting like 2 notes. One of them is up here, and one of them is down here. But then if you patch the square wave into a transformer, and it was like a tiny little transformer, you're going to get a really weird sort of shape. Now, that's going to be just like a really weird, weak, lame square wave. If you listen to the output of this transformer, then it's going to be a considerably lower level. It's not able to handle the full power of the square wave. It's not going to be able to go down in frequency. It's going to start becoming a pulse wave. It's not going to be a sharp enough rise time because it's a transformer. And the littler and crappier the transformer it is, the more it will do all of this stuff. Like you can get ultra micro miniature surplus transformers from all electronics that are built onto this little wiring network and have like a light on them or something. and just pulls from equipment or stuff that people had manufactured that they never used, surplus stuff. And it's a really bad transformer as far as reproducing the square wave. But then if you patch this output to an FM input, which probably is capable of making such a strong sound anyway that you might not want the full power of the square wave going into the FM, but you want to attenuate it anyway. Well, you can attenuate it in a transformer or into a chain of transformers and just completely mutate the wave until it's like this weird sort of slowed lumps on each of these with a chain of transformers going. You patch that into the FM input and you have a distinct voice from very, very cheap parts. And that is a interesting concept because some of that stuff is why we have distinct instruments with recognizable sounds. Like Roland 808s and 909s are made from very simple parts. And the very old parts, you got a Roland 303, which the filter is diode-based rather than transistor-based like in the Moogs, which raises the question of what happens when you do a light-emitting diode-based filter. And I haven't tried that yet, but somebody should. You could do the light-emitting diode-based using these little tiny diodes or much larger, brighter ones. And it's possible that it will completely fail to do the legitimate 303 replica sound, which means it'll be super different. And super different might be very interesting. Now, since I'm fooling around with all of that, I was in the middle of doing something that I might quickly sort of try to continue. And because the thing is, this stuff that I'm talking about, I'm probably able to either put together myself or produce kits that people can have that they can put together themselves on the perf board that I like to use. Or indeed, like over here, I've got a small case that my old multi-band hardware compressor thing was in. That I put a layer of perf board on the top of the case, so you can do other things as well. I have high hopes of eventually having my studio desk have huge bays that are mostly perf board and stuff going on there. But you can wire this stuff up onto the perf board in such a way that you've got your little banks of LEDs showing what logic levels are happening. And you can get very cheaply these individual pin headers, which I believe you can plug stuff into, much like Bastel likes doing it with. Oh, quick, ask the question about console. When I see it, I will answer it. I'll derail for this because this is just sort of freewheeling Chris from Airwindows thinking of new things to do. You can get headers that you could plug chips and things into, like double inline pin chips, dip pins, or single inline pin headers, that you can also plug those little patchboard thingies into, like as if you were making connections on an experimenter board. But they're these tiny little metal things, and you can buy them by the thousands, also for about 2 cents each if you look the right place and know what you're getting. You're basically buying the individual headers before they're assembled into the containers, and you could install them into isolated places on the perf board, solder them in from the other side, and then patch points into just these tiny little dots where you can plug stuff. And again, it's kind of like Bastel over here, my Castells there. I've got those set up right now so that you can plug in Eurorack jacks, but I can still plug into the pins where they're supposed to go. Bastel does a bunch of stuff like that. And the thing about that, the formulas for the various consoles. For formula for console 4 and earlier is like the drive algorithm. That's you can get these things basically by looking at the source code on GitHub. And console 4 and earlier is basically designed so that the encode is essentially drive, because it's a very simple mathematical calculation, and the idea was to have it be the lowest intensity for CPU usage, because they'd have to be on everything. So the earlier consoles are based on drive. Console 5, and all the decode for the console 4 and earlier are a more complicated thing that tries to exactly mimic what the encode is doing, but doesn't actually do it. It's pretty close, and there's more to it, but it's not exactly a perfect mirror. Console 5 is using sine and arcsine. So those are more sophisticated calculations. That is, sine is and it's not spiral, it is from density. So the console 5 encode and decode is simply a sine calculation, which doesn't even need any guard things like, if it's more than 1, it's equal to 1. The sine calculation doesn't technically need those, because it'll just sort of wrap around. It'll start getting quieter again. And on the bus for console 5, it's a arcsine calculation, which does need to be clipped to 1 and -1. I cannot remember whether I'm doing it just with the 1 calculation or whether I've got it so that you can feed negative values into it. But I do know that if you give it more than 1 or -1, the calculation blows up. So I had to clip that one just in order to make it work at all. Otherwise, it goes infinite and dies. And your dog goes like, up. Unreal floating point number, I died, I'm dead. And then, of course, console 6 is the algorithm the fella came up with Tor Gristle. And it was like, I've been doing this in shaders, what would it do? And I tried it out, and I was like, okay, this does seem to exactly mimic the thing, and it's more intense than doing it by a sine. So that one is based on a pretty simple formula. But some of the other ones, like console 5, that's not even a formula, that's just a single math operation. It's the floating point calculation for sine or arcsine, which have many uses, but this is one. So yeah. So to get back to the calculations and plans for fancy things that I'm building. And granted, these have been coming rather slowly, but there's a reason for that. One of them is I can't afford to necessarily just buy all the parts at once. So I wait around until it's like, okay, I can spend $20 on LEDs, and now I have the LEDs that I needed. Months and months ago, I got jacks, and so then I had the jacks that I needed, and so on and so forth. But these early things are basically just coming up with original designs. Like the thing with S written on it is the subwoofer companion for my Mother 32, where I can plug one of the oscillators into it. It depends. I mean, sine is a circle shape. Sine is not an S shape. Sine basically wraps around to go negative and then positive again, so it's just circle shape. And arcsine, you can't do a circle shape because it goes like, and then you have infinity, so it can't go any farther. But it's designed to be the exact inverse of what sine is. So part of my scheme here is getting these parts and doing stuff like I've repeatedly shown the idea for the Daemon, the sequencer thing, where you'd be able to plug in like Eurorack jacks and have 4 outputs, and it could probably be done with mostly just the chip and the jacks and the switches and probably lots of diodes, and not necessarily that much in the way of resistors and things, because it's like very, very simple. But what I'm thinking is, remember a while back where I had this briefcase, and I was like, I'm going to come up with a way of putting, I think this is before I even had my full collection of perf board. I got a good amount of perf board a while back. But I had this briefcase, and I was like, I will come up with a way of mounting these things into the briefcase and then having this crazy like patch bay thing going on. Well, I wouldn't necessarily have to do it with Eurorack stuff, for which the jacks cost like $1, and the patch cords cost maybe a couple of bucks, depending. And it starts becoming like, if you have a really big, complicated pile of stuff, then it'll be hundreds of dollars. But the chips and bits and things and the diodes and the light emitting diodes and stuff can be insanely cheap. So why couldn't you make something where you just had these little patch cables? Here, I'll grab one. These little patch cables, such as we patch into I've got some of those patched between the Bastel castles now. Because those are, oh, hey, Patrick. Those are making a connection now because Bastel used that as the patching mechanism. And the thing about it is you can get these for much cheaper than Eurorack cables. They're not shielded, but neither is Buchla. And they're smaller than Buchla banana cables. And they'll handle a fair amount of current. I mean, these are bare wires, and it's a fairly respectable size of bare wire, and they are a specific kind that you can get. They're made for going into experimenter boards and stuff, but you could also plug it into a socket that you'd put a chip into. Or if you can't, I'll find out because I'm going to be trying it. So you could make your crazy perf board synthesizer with all the chips and things. And then it would look kind of like you'd have your chip here, and it's in the perf board. There's just lots of holes surrounding it. And you might have a little pin header that's connected to the pin on the circuit. Say the one that is the power supply, for instance, maybe that runs behind the perf board. But the one that's like, this is the input to your octave divider, like as exists on the next to the Moog there. You'd have a little perf board thingy, and it would be a little pin header sticking out the top. And then you'd take your very cheap and inexpensive little experimenter board thingy and plug it into that and patch it to something. So you'd have this weird nest of these little tiny wires, and it would be like circuit bending, but live circuit bending. And if you're lucky, the things that you chose would be you'd be able to plug it and unplug it, more than a few times. And if it wore out, I guess you'd just like desolder it, pull it out, and put a new one in. So you'd be maintaining it if you needed to. But depending upon how often you need to plug and unplug. Because honestly, as far as your rack is concerned, I feel like the jacks that I use, which are a lot larger than people normally use, should be able to handle more plugs and unplugs. And the jacks that Eurorack designers typically use are so tiny that I just can't believe that they would survive a super huge number of plugs and unplugs. These are not as reliable as guitar jacks. And then again, you can get ones that look more like this. You can get the individual things that go inside these, and fairly decent ones. You can get ones that are bare metal, or you can get ones with like special little bronze inserts, or you can get them all totally gold plated, stuff like that. And you can choose to get them for very cheaply. So you can get 1,000 of them for like $18, that kind of thing. So you'd have 1,000 of these individual dots that you can plug these wires into. And then you put them anywhere you want around the chips. So the next question becomes, if you've got these chips that are alive because they've got electrical power going to the behind the board, and then the front of board is filled with all of these little places that you can patch wires into, how do you tell where stuff goes? And that is where we have come today, because I was taking some time to look into things like, what is the color coding that's used on stuff like the ARP Odyssey or Bookla? And that's what I'm looking at the moment. That's where I was at when I went live and stuff, because the idea is you can do stuff like this and get these little parts and maybe be able to put a thing together where it's like, hey, send Chris $40 and you will have all the parts you need for some insane, like, build into your briefcase synthesizer, including the perf board, just everything. Just a big old slab of perf board, and it's like, hey, put all of this stuff here, and then solder it together, and go and have some fun, make crazy noises. Because there's all kinds of fun stuff that you can do with this kind of, like, it's dead easy to make an oscillator with the right kind of circuitry. I've discovered that it's dead easy to make a octave divider using the right circuitry. My little patch there that goes from the Moog to a octave divider. Actually, it's got 2 octave dividers. There's a single octave, and then it goes to a second one, which is a sub-octave below that. So I have 2 separate octave divided square waves coming out of there. And then that I can patch back into the Moog, and that gives me the octave down square wave on the external input. Or I could patch it into a frequency input if I wanted, just whatever. In fact, I have done that. I've patched it through the stuff that's part of the Mother 32, and the cost of that additional thing was probably less than $5. This is the kind of stuff that lights me up and makes me be really interested, is ways that people can get their hands on this kind of technology and really be able to do it no matter what their circumstances are. Because if you can do that, you can make an oscillator. So if you can make an oscillator, you could patch the oscillator into that and then be able to take the voltages out, and now you've got 3 octaves of the oscillator. Or you make another one of your octave divider things, and now you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then if you summed all of those, you have a sort of really horrible triangle wave, and it's just everything starts to get more interesting as you start doing funky stuff with it. But the question becomes, how do you find your way around something that just looks like a nest of weird cables and such? Like, I can make it so that the voltage plus and the grounds and such don't necessarily have these patch points. They can be hidden underneath the thing. And all of that, or various other maintenance stuff, like there's connections that you need to make the octave divider thing work. So I can have an octave divider thing where it's like there's one of these jack points for the input, there's one of these jack points for the output, and you can patch that to the second input, or just use them independently. And there's other connections that need to be present, but they don't necessarily have to have the patch points, making it easier to find your way around. But it becomes a question of, like, what do you need to be able to see on this? So I was thinking, since you can get these individual patch points just as sort of bare metal, it's this tiny metal cup that you plug one of these into, why not color them? And that's why I was starting to do this, because this is the initial stage of me figuring out what would you do if you were building a synthesizer just on a piece of perf board out of raw CMOS chips, which I have millions of now. And it's also something where I would be very capable of, like roughly 26 bucks a pop, because the individual chips in quantity, and that's not even counting whether I could do a large order of them, individual chips in quantity are about 26 cents. So getting 100 of them in these little tubes is about 26 bucks a pop. So I can get large numbers of chips that I could then send out to people if I was doing something like synthesizer DIY building at cost, just to get it in people's hands. I could do that and send people the guts of making a hardware synthesizer for like under 10 bucks, or just that area where it's like you can play with it. It doesn't matter if something goes wrong, it's fine. And everything is designed around that. So the idea becomes, let's do this, and then take like maybe, find Dick Blix or something like that, a set of acrylic paints you can buy, and just buy some little tubes of paints and get like, I don't know, a brush, a toothpick, whatever, and go about making this kind of thing, and then just sort of daubing paint on the pegboard so that you can see what kind of connection it is that you're making from where to where. And you get used to, like, you can take paint on the top of the chip, or take a silver Sharpie maybe, and go, there, that chip now says oct. So that becomes your octa divider. It reminds you that you patch into this place is here, and if you know that the input is like green and the output is blue, then you patch into the input and take the output from the output, and you kind of know what you're doing. You kind of know what you're doing a little bit. Or say if you did this, you had a chip that was doing this kind of stuff, or a set of chips, and you did a big circle, it might remind you, like, this is the chip that I'm using to get sine wave outputs. Because the thing about it is, if you take the right kind of chip, and it's doing an oscillator thing for you, you can have one point on the outputs of it that is a square wave output, because that's the output of the comparator or whatever. But the way this makes a frequency is by taking this very output and, say, either on the back or just, you can patch it together, running it through a resistance to this input place, because there's an inverter in here, and then there's a capacitor. And these things could be on the outside, the front part of it, or it could be on the back part of it. It can be hidden as much as you want, because it's useful to have all the bits available, but it's also useful to have these as individual building blocks, and the parts that you see on the front part of it are just the inputs and outputs. They're the places that you patch. But you'd have this stuff behind there, meaning that this part would be the square wave output. This would be a triangle wave output. And this would also simultaneously be the place where you would sync it. Like if you hit this with a positive voltage and force it to be just full voltage, you're charging this capacitor, ignoring the resistor, so you've just resynced it. So now you have oscillators with sync. Or you can retime them. Like if this is a oscillator that's counting, you can make it switch back to 1 just by hitting this with voltage. So it's either, you can use it as the waveform, or you can use it as sync, or both at the same time. For all I know, is who knows. Like, pretty much all you need to know is, like, this is how some of the voltages work. This is how some of the stuff works. So it also becomes a electronics learning kit of how all this basic stuff, how it does this stuff. And the neat thing about that is, the individual chips are like 26 cents. The individual pins for these headers and things might be as little as like between 1 and 2 cents, depending upon how many you get. And I'll be getting myself into a situation where I could get like 10,000 LEDs, and now they're like half a cent each rather than 2 cents each. And then I'd be able to sell these kits and be charging people half a cent each for the LEDs. You get 4 times as many as you would otherwise. You get like 4 times as many of these little sockets. So you'd really be able to play and have a lot of stuff that you could do for insanely cheaply, because I think that should happen. I think that totally should happen. So back we go to this. I left off where I was looking up things like ARP and Bookla and such, and I didn't get up to Bookla, but I was writing down the kinds of stuff that people have previously done regarding this. Oh, master run a bus and a bunch of different ones and channels, and the master can control the channel plugins. Yes, I know that exists. No, I don't know how they do it. Simple answer to that one. Nor do I know whether it's graceful or whether it causes problems that you don't anticipate, because it seems kind of sketchy. It's like these processes, it's not built into the plugin standard. No. For all I know, they're like writing to the hard disk every time something changes, and that'd be messy as anything. Because my stuff doesn't write to or read from the hard disk by itself. It's not what it's about. It doesn't talk. It's one of the reasons I can do stuff like work with modern Apple ecosystems is that I don't step outside of the sandbox. It doesn't try to talk to the hard disk or anything of the sort. So yeah, with the ARP Odyssey, it turns out that their color coding is like VCO1 is all blue colored and VCO2 is all green colored, which for a synthesizer makes sense. You got LFOs, and LFOs are pink colored, and their sample and hold is yellow. Noise is white colored, and everything that they have to do regarding envelopes is red colored, which is neat. But what we're looking at regarding the perf board thing is a situation where like everything could be anything. Like there's no distinction between LFOs and VCOs unless you've designed and built them so that this is my high frequency one and this is just specifically an LFO. And there is a distinction between oscillators and noise, but there's not necessarily a distinction between specific oscillators. So having them each have their own colors seems like that wouldn't work. So that might not be that helpful for me. I have got a report here, and I'll note that down. I don't know what modcan A is, but I've just read a thing that says the modcan A modular standard has input is dark umber. Input is a gray. I think I have a gray pencil here. Yep, I do. So with modcan that is seemingly less colorful, audio inputs are gray and CV inputs are white. I think you can begin to see the problem here. And outputs are yellow, so here's a yellow pencil. I have a goodly collection of art supplies, although I don't have the exact small acrylic paints thing that I would want. Because if I'm doing this, I would want to be able to point people towards, like, go to Dick Blick, which is an arts supplier, and buy this particular small collection of acrylic paints. It comes in a little box, and it's for beginners. And you'd have a set of tiny little tubes of acrylic paint that you could use for all this kind of stuff, and it would probably last for a really long time. And then it's up to you as to how you would do that. So this modcan format and just writing gate trigger now is not nearly as pretty as the ARP Odyssey. because it is kind of only white and gray and yellow and red. And that's lame. Got to do better than that. But it's got gray for signal inputs, white for control voltage inputs, which presumably means they're assuming that we're not feeding signals into the control voltages. That, or it's expecting only positive voltages. And yellow for signal or CV output, which is like, okay, fair enough, that's an output, that makes sense. And red for gate trigger logic sync input or output. Now the trouble there is that this is built up out of a gate output. Like your triangle wave is here, but that's like an input. And then it's getting the square wave because that is a gate output. So I'm not sure if I'm down for the modcan way of doing things. So the next thing I'm going to do is look at Bookla. But first, Zafor has a question. So let me read that and see where we get there. Convolution versus reamping. So here's the thing, is you can use convolution to get interesting and complicated results, and it might not be quite as real, but it's really kind of up to you as to which you choose to go with. You can use convolution to get slightly more controlled sounds than you might with the real thing. I will say that with my experience, at least regarding guitar, I'm happier with my isolation box. I was doing guitar in a bunch of early jams and things, and using various techniques to do essentially a DI style thing, where I'm doing the DI from whatever distortion unit or something that I've got, and then running it through, say, filtration or pedals, amp modeling kind of thing, and going direct into the board. And I could get results out of that. It was like, okay, I wasn't actually using convolution. I wasn't actually using like cabinet impulse on those. Although I have done so before. I've done that before. But then when I set up the guitar amp into the speaker, inside an isolation box, into a microphone and stuff, it was better for what I was trying to do. It sat better with the stuff that I was doing. So what I would say is you can't replace reamping with a convolution impulse, but that doesn't make the convolution impulse bad. It's just different. Like doing, the real thing versus reamping or whatever, I would say the more central and spotlight the thing is supposed to be. Like, here's an example in that context. I did a track, which is actually not in any of my videos yet, but I probably could put it in, that was another one of those fandom tracks where I was singing songs about My Little Pony or whatever. But it was written by this other fellow, and I thought it was a brilliant track with a brilliant vocal line and stuff, and it was just the coolest song. I changed it a tiny bit, but I recorded it off of his... he started it off with tracks where he had stems available. So there was the synthesizer stem, and then there was his vocals, which I wasn't using. And I took the synthesizer stem, which was very kind of chiptune-y. It was very like a bunch of square waves and stuff, and a very cheerful sound, like and started tracking on top of that. So that was a in-the-box mix and experience, and early versions of console, if I'm not mistaken. And I used probably EXS24 to do a really slamming rock and roll drum track, much like I did with Discord Welcome Home, which has been heard on my videos. And those drum tracks are fake. They are my actual drums, and they're my actual drum playing, but they're samples being triggered by machines, so they don't tire, they don't get wrong. And I did that on this other track, which is called Wing Power. And point being, in recording guitars on that track, one of the things that I did was some early experiments with trying to do a solo guitar and have it actually through an amp and mic the amp. I didn't have that really nailed at the time. So it was an okay sound, but it wasn't the best sound. I can do better now. And for a number of the background tracks, I just ran a Tom Scholz Rockman. It was one of the older, actually one of the newer ones. It was a Rockman Soloist. And I had various tracks that were doing that. And that is the definition of like a amp simulator style sound, that it doesn't even have a convolution impulse as part of it, although you could put one. But instead it was just like, okay, this is the Rockman. It's its little very soft clipping distortion saturation. It's got a fair amount of gain on tap if you want it. And then the output that goes to the headphones and lineouts is just very heavily filtered. And there's a bunch of bass boost, but it doesn't have the acoustic qualities of a speaker or a room or a microphone or anything like that. And that was exactly right for that particular song. Because that song, and I did another song in the same general area where I took synthesizers and I reamped them. And I got a big beefy sound out of the reamping them, but in that case it didn't help that song that much. That song that I did the reamping on, it could have done better by just taking, arranging it a little bit differently, doing things a little bit differently. Because in that one, it's like this doesn't actually need to feel like grungy, gut bucket, blues and rock and roll kind of thing. It doesn't need to have that level of girth and dimension to it. That's going to a background sound that's not the focus of people's attention. And the vocals I was doing that were supposed to be the focus of people's attention, weren't all that perfect because they were mimicking a very synthetic vocal line that having a human quality there just made it kind of strange and weird. It wasn't super successful, although it was very interesting, but it wasn't super successful. By contrast, the track I was telling you about called Wing Power, on that one, I had a big upfront vocal, and it was carrying most of the attention, and the lead guitar was also, it was mic'd. It wasn't as good as I could have had it, but it was big enough to carry attention. And then these little background parts, I was playing guitar there, and they were some pretty lively parts. Like the very end, there was a mistake on the lead guitar part, so I threw in some additional arrangement parts to kind of cover that. And I'm playing the guitar, and just a little lilt to it, little bends and things in there. Through the Rockman, in just sort of the semi-overdrive setting and stuff, it was a very thin, weedy little sound, but it was doubling something else, and man, it just ended up being perfect. It was exactly what was needed. So the take on reamping sounds, be it synths or vocals or guitars, it totally depends upon what you're trying to do with it, because that is also part of your palette. That's also part of your palette of doing stuff. If you take everything and reamp everything and give everything natural reverb and everything has the full size and all the detail and stuff, then everything is small because there's no contrast in there. If you have stuff that is doing, supplying musical force, but there is just a raw, primitive simplicity to it, much like directly, it's like never mind even using convolution for it. Try some of these sounds and just plain sort of EQ them into the right place or run them through whatever it is, whether it be a cheesy cab simulator kind of thing that isn't even a convolution thing. There are cases where that's going to be exactly what your mix needs, because the aspect that you're trying to do with the part that you might be reamping or might not, if that needs to carry musical weight but not drag attention away from other stuff, that's when you start making stuff simplified. Another way that works is when in hip hop people do the low res, old school sampler kind of things. And I think some of that started out being by accident, but it became successful and effective because it's that useful of a technique. You take your loud backbeat, but it needs to really hit physically, but that's not what you want people focusing on because it's like a hip hop song, so there's a rapper and you need to pay attention to him. Then the loud backbeat is off of an old Akai sampler or something, and it's got a lot of interesting texture to it, but it just doesn't have the kind of fine detail to command attention. And it's the same every time around, so you tune it out. It has all kinds of power and force, and you can build a thing out of it, but it's not going to grab attention away from the person that is the focus of the song. Now, up a little bar in the scroll there, ozone imager. I don't know what the ozone imager is. It's possible that it is a convolution thing. I don't really know. You never can tell. It's like, in a sense, iron oxide is a convolution thing. It works under similar principles. Follow-up from Zafor. Analog EQs will never have exactly the same curve. Is that good practice in the digital domain? I'm going to say no. I don't think there's any use in like slightly randomizing stuff. I don't believe that is where the magic of analog comes from. Period. I absolutely don't believe that. I don't believe in adding noise to things either, although there's probably uses for it. Like, certainly dithering, there's useful adding noise there, but I think the magic of analog is not so much in like all the EQ curves are slightly different, all of the, the travel of the pots have slightly different curves for each one because the resistance material in the fader is slightly different, so therefore all the faders need to have very slight departures from linearity. It's like, no, they don't. That means nothing. It's not useful to you. Analog is about completely obliterating all of the digital limitations when you break stuff down into samples and then start running into aliasing, quantization, and stuff, which is why the work that I do, granted I haven't worked in aliasing very much, but it's a very specific problem, but the quantization stuff that I work on super hard is for that exact reason. It's not, I believe, about making sure that all the little things that you can do in the digital mix don't have exactly the same behavior, because if you're just doing it by ear, you dial stuff in, and you're not looking at where you set the knobs because you're using a control surface or something that's handy for being able to just mix more intuitively. Supposing you do that and you absolutely nail it, it doesn't matter that the circuitry, that the programming caused the knobs to go to different places for different settings. You've just adjusted the places because you just magically got it exactly right, by ear. You just compensated for that. If you looked at the numbers of where the things were set, you would see, they're set to slightly different numbers on the knobs. But since you tuned in and you set it just right by ear, you happen to have set it to as if you had just set them to the same number and they matched. There's no reason to have the different things in the digital audio workstation have randomization factors added and never having the same curve and stuff. It's not useful because you're shooting for something that is part of the creative aspect of your mix and is part of getting a sound. And you don't want to not get the sound if you're looking to get the sound. So that is my, certainly for right now, and I think I'm going to be sticking with that one for a long time. I don't believe that there's any benefit to making everything slightly different. stereo enhancement tool. I got mostly Za4 asking questions, although I see Asterion. Honestly, I'm happiest working in mono. I'm happiest working in LCR specifically, because LCR is like mono but not. LCR is left, center, right. So you choose like, okay, this thing goes into the center, and this thing goes into the center, and this thing goes into the center. It's like the mix of Proud Mary. It's like Creedence Clearwater Revival's Proud Mary. Classic hit song. They mixed the thing. They mixed it in stereo. They figured out later that they chose not to put anything in either of the side channels. Because back in the day, that was mostly just like, okay, we'll put something in all of the sides. And back in the day of the Beatles, they only paid attention to the mono mix. And then the guy later was like, okay, which side do we put these things on? And they're like, meh, because they only had 4 tracks to start with. But making a big style mix, I think it's most useful to just have stuff up the center, kind of like the mixer of Proud Mary. And then if you have stereo elements, which of course we do, I've got stereo synthesizers all over the place, and I enjoy using stereo ping pong delays. I think that's great fun. Those things just go hard left, hard right. In fact, I have plans to make a sort of perf board style mixing board specifically for the purpose of replacing the one that I use, so that I can have a mixing board that is much more along the lines of like, okay, this is pure bypass. There's no parts in this, just go. And when I do, I'll be making things in LCR. Specifically, it'll be LCCR. And what that means is not Creedence Clearwater Revival, although it should. But what that means is I'm going to design it in such a way that you have the left bus, the right bus, and the center bus, but the center bus feeds 2 separate parallel amplifiers. And those parallel amplifiers are what mix into the left and right buses. There'll be essentially no connection between the 2 buses, so the separation will be completely insane. And with pan pots, you can't really do that, because if you're going to have a pan pot, it's always going to be connecting the channels to some extent. You're not going to get perfect separation. Oh no, Samuel's got a friend that sends things over Discord. That doesn't sound good. Styrian, up to you. Honestly, while developing plugins, I'm often not developing them in the context of a mix. What I do when I'm developing plugins is firstly sort of design and build the plugin, which is, it's like doing a Eurorack module that's not plugged into anything or powered up. When I'm building the plugin, it's not like it's up and running. I'm just tinkering around with the code, and it's like, okay, here are some inputs here are some outputs here. What am I going to do between those points? And with something like consoles, it's like, okay, I'm going to be thinking of this in terms of 2 matching things, and this one needs to change the transfer function like this, and then this one needs to complement it. That is complement. Complement is saying, oh, you're such a pretty plugin. But complement is these 2 combined together come out to the same thing that you started with. And the way that I'm talking about gain staging with those things depends upon what the algorithm is, and it's more relevant to stuff like compressors and things, and setting up the gain levels. And very often when I'm working with plugins, what I'll do is I'll be testing it in a program called Twisted Wave, typically, and that's a stereo plugin, not a DAW. It's a stereo program. So what I'll do is I'll load up this file that I've got that there could be any kinds of files like this, but in this case, this is the one that I use. And it is I'm trying to remember where it comes from. It's some kind of radio station processor. I forget exactly the name, like the breakaway processor. And the purpose of the product that this came out of was making a radio station loudness maximizer that handled all different kinds of levels. So they set up this thing that was called the Breakaway Audio Processor Torture Test,
which is a big pile of piracy. And that's why I can't show it to you on any of the videos, because I never do. What it is about an hour, maybe an hour and a half or so, like a solid hour of excerpts from different songs just patched together. So what you'll have is like, the original CD release of this. It's all 16-bit, but if I load it into the stereo program, I'm playing it through a 24-bit kind of thing. But it's this. It starts off with two different versions of this one CD that is some kind of really lame song. I'm so familiar with it because it's the first one that comes up. And I don't know what it is, and I don't know who sings it, but there's two different pressings of it. One of them goes like, "They passed me by, all of those great romances, you were the one, robbing me of my rightful chance." It's like a country song. And there's this one version of it that is fairly dynamic, and then there's another version that is just smashed to crap and so unbearably over loud that it's just disgusting. And it follows the first one immediately with the second one, and then cuts to Aerosmith. And then it is all these different things, like The Police. There's a version of Another Brick in the Wall, Part 2, from a old Wall CD, apparently, by Pink Floyd, that is in everything about it is just insanely quiet, like 24 dB quieter than everything else, because this old CD was apparently some kind of musical. Oh, was it now? Cool. Wow. But the Pink Floyd, because it's made to do like the big culminating things of Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, like da 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 da, we don't need no education. It's meant to do that without distorting. And they got a hold of some kind of old CD of this where they had mastered it to the CD where nothing was clipped, so that everything could be like full dynamics of everything. And as a result, it's like infinitely quieter than anybody else's CD ever. And they've got a clip of that on there, and they've got a sine wave sweep on there, and they've got like Owner of a Lonely Heart by Yes on there, just stuff from talk radio. And I think a breakaway broadcast processor again. And again, it's a big pile of piracy, but it's also a series of basically CD clips that cover an insanely wide range of different kinds of sound. And that's what I use to test plugins on. Things like compressors or whatever. I will just, something? I am going to go and have a look at that right now because, let's see. Copy link location. Damn straight. That's exactly what it is. I would have sworn that was some kind of country song. Apparently not. She had never left at all. Yep, I've heard that before a million billion times because that's the thing that leads off this this essentially mixtape. And it never finishes any of the songs. It does like 20 to 30 seconds of each of the songs. And it's this amazing combination. It's like this is also the first time that I heard System of a Down, because they used the intro to Toxicity as one of their examples. Like, and that's the first time I'd heard that song, and I was like, I have to find out what that is now, and I did, and I was like, okay, now I actually own the CD, so I'm allowed to legally listen to that. But when I test out plugins, especially if it's something like a compressor or whatever, I'll fire up that example thing and just start playing it and playing with the knobs, seeing if any of these crazy tracks at incomprehensibly different volume levels and everything, how it reacts to all that kind of stuff. Like, where does it distort? Am I able to get the right result? How is it behaving? Which means that my plugins get developed on a range of output that hovers around what people master CDs to. So I typically make my stuff. Handling fairly hot signals as far as digital gain staging is concerned, and console 6 is an exception. Like if I run this kind of thing, this audio reference that I use into console 6, what I'll get is it just distorts like hell. Or especially, and I do not know why the comment with the link is not showing on your feed. I didn't do anything, and I've got it set up for live chat, so you can look up. What the link says is https :// genius.com/ABBA-1-of-us-lyrics. So that's the one. I've heard that song so many times and never knew it was ABBA because there's not really any credits to this big pile of audio. I don't know where any of it came from. Clearly now I do know where one of it came from. That's kind of neat. But, and I would not have guessed that they were Swedish. I thought that was some Southerners singing a country song. Yeah, the chat is on live chat because generally I can get away with it. Only when people start really misbehaving do I first make the window disappear from the stream, and then secondly, if it's really bad, maybe I'll put it on to live chat. I mean top chat. I think that perhaps that is a individual setting for each person on it. I know that it's going out as live chat. So here's the thing. I'm going to do a little search for booklet color coding, and I believe I will quickly reach a result. That's funny. So, booklet color coding is apparently on Wikipedia: red's lust, yellow is jealousy, green is good taste. So if you have a booklet synthesizer and you plug into the red output, no, I'm making that up. Somebody on this Muffler thread was wising off. And violet purple is authority, so use that for your CV controls. Nope, somebody has real answers here. So the booklet thing, they've got blue, purple, and green as CV outputs. They've got black and gray as CV inputs. Red is pulse outputs. Orange is pulse inputs. That's interesting, and I suppose that since CV can count as waveforms, then that makes sense, I guess. But I'm still not quite sure that's enough information for me. Maybe I'll find some more about it. Because bear in mind, and there's the manual, so let's go and see what we can find there too. Manual says, do not take the 200E system into your bath, sauna, or hot tub. Cool. Spoil sports. So control voltage inputs are generally black, sometimes gray, they say. CV outputs are generally blue, sometimes violet, and occasionally green. They're not saying why, though, and that's frustrating. So this is the same information that I had before. I'm going to copy that to my desktop as I like to do. If I can. Maybe I can't. However, I can do a image shot of that. So what I'm going to be looking at, yeah, hell, if I had an Yamaha GX1, I would still have it. No question about it. And then I've got another image that I can drag which says exactly the same thing. So what I'm going to be wanting to find out is what the difference is between red and purple booklet outputs, and this is not actually telling me it. So let's search for Buchla color coding blue purple. And I'm still getting stuff that here's a Banana Jack color scheme, so I have several options. Because here's the thing. What I need to do here is come up with something that's going to work for these. And it's going to work for these little CMOS chips and tiny little patch points where I'll be able to paint the individual patch points different colors and actually have it be useful. Given that anything can patch into anything, so it's got to make some kind of sense. But I feel kind of like Buchla is not quite enough. So they got so we have a distinction between gates and triggers and CVs, and that kind of makes sense because it's like CVs can be a varying voltage and gates can be a distinct voltage. Also, we have a similarity here between Modcan and Buchla, and I think also, oh no, maybe not necessarily Bugbrand, where red counts for triggers. So let's add that in as well. So we can probably settle on, because the idea is if I do this right, people who have some familiarity with these things will be able to look at the insane little pegboard thing and go, oh, I bet I could, and make stuff actually happen. So if I have that being consistent, and boy, we have a lot of possible things like this. Yeah, there's Modcan A. Also, we have surge. And I like the idea of the surge being, and again, pulse is going to be red. I think we have a consistent factor here where pulse can be red in general. I don't like the uses of blacks and grays here. If I can come up with something else, I'll come up with something else just so that the resulting things can be prettier and more interesting looking. LB Design Panther Jacks. Again, red, yellow, and orange seem to be about triggers. Castle Electronics, maybe not so much. Bugbrand also isn't using that. Bugbrand is making a distinction between audio and CV. I don't like that, so perhaps we're not going to do that. Although Bugbrand is having the system ground be black, I kind of like that. I think maybe that might work. So Buchla gate out and gate in are different. So I will grab an orange pencil. These are actually also water soluble, so that's always fun. So Buchla gate out is red, as with many other things. Gate in can be orange. And I think also it's fairly likely I'll be able to identify or find some kind of little starter acrylic paint set that includes these sort of basic spectrum colors in such a way that people would be able to be like, oh, $5 for a paint set? Cool. And then start getting that and using it without having to fuss a lot over like which individual pigments to buy. Not that you couldn't also do that. That's something that could be done. I'm not entirely happy with the way that this completely clashes with how the ARP Odyssey does it, but then I was figuring that might happen. Because ideally I would like to be able to do something where people with various kinds of familiarity could look at stuff and be like, huh, that might work. So with the ARP, stuff that has to do with the VCOs are individual shades of blue or green. So VCO1 is going to be blue, and all over the synth, you've got stuff associated with that VCU. Because, of course, since it's a synth, we're not patching over the front of it. Oh, go ahead and ask the stupid code question before 1 o'clock, where I'll tune out and continue doing this, most likely. It's interesting that ARP has pink for LFOs. That might make sense. And if it's possible to make a sample and hold as part of the general DIY synth circuit, or noise is a similar thing, that would work too. I'm not down with the modcan using gray and white for those things, and nobody is using pink except for ARP. Oh, okay. Yes, Bo, what I'm doing there, and I'll show you on another piece of papers, because I might as well keep on using. Eventually I'm going to use up all these pieces of paper, and then I'm going to go to like 4x6 index cards, because I can get lots of those. These I actually had to cut into pieces in order to make them be this size. Go figure. Here's what I'm doing. Got a waveform. So I have separate code. And I'm doing this with it. What I'm doing is going like, oh, okay, are you a positive waveform? In that case, let's do this algorithm just like this. If you're not a positive algorithm, let's do the thing that we're doing after having negated you. And then we'll take the output once we're done with that, and we'll negate the output again. So we're basically doing exactly the same thing, and this works for many things. I used to do that with just simple sine function things, which I didn't actually need to do, and I also do it with drive, the algorithm drive, and the low frequency stuff having to do with 2-tape and Fathom 5, and that also uses a technique like this. What you do is you just make everything be what's called ABS. ABS parentheses. Any mathematics you put in there, or in C, what you like to do is FABS, because FAB means floating point ABS. So that will let you do the numbers as they're coming in. Just ABS is integer values. And that mathematics basically makes everything be positive. It does this to it. Everything is only positive no matter what. And what you do is you go through this and go, okay, now we've got this. So was the input value negative when I started off? Because I've made a new number that we're going to use, but the input value that's coming in, was this negative? If it was negative, I start doing it backwards, and we ignore this part and just make the output be the inverse of what we started. You say, okay, if the input stuff was less than 0, then let's take the output stuff and go output stuff equals if I do this, out equals negative out. I just made it be negative again. So basically all I'm doing is, for any of these things where they only work with positive values, I never mind that, it's just fine. Because I'll go, was my input less than 0? In that case, I'll work everything as if it was all over 0. And I'll be looking at the input signal that was coming in. And if the input signal was negative, I'm doing all of with the ABS, I'm making all of the math work only on positive signals. And then once I'm done, I've got this thing that's positive. It's always positive. And I'll look back at what I started with and go, okay, was I starting with something that was negative? If so, out equals negative out. I flip it back to negative. So I'm looking at where I started. I'm looking at what the original sample was. And that's how the code knows when to flip it back to negative. It's a simple trick, but it's pretty effective. And it doesn't take a lot of calculation. It's not going to hurt the CPU much. It's a very basic, simple thing to do. And so if you're coding stuff and you run into that problem, that's how you deal with it, is just do all your stuff on positive and then work out whether to make it negative. Now, there are, like if you're doing something where you're doing like a low-pass filter, so you got this waveform, sometimes it becomes negative. You're doing something that's like a low-pass filter, but for whatever reason it only wants to go in positive, so you've got it doing that. And then your end result is just kind of going, wandering around over here. And in that case, you wouldn't want to look at the initial thing and go like, oh, okay, so if this was here, then it must mean that the output is negative, because then you'd be like, flick over to here and then back again. It depends upon the algorithm. It depends upon what you're doing. But the way the code knows is that I still remember what the input sample was. Like at any given time, and this is not dissimilar to playing with this kind of stuff where it's like, okay, we've got inputs and outputs and stuff of all these different chips. You know, you've got code, the input stuff starts here, and you're doing your code. And that's giving you an output result. And your code can do stuff like go, okay, this is all only positive. But unless you've changed this number, it's still there to look at. You start here and you go, okay, make this be another variable, put it in another little box, and we'll do this stuff with it, we'll do this stuff with it, we'll take the result and put it in this other little box, and we'll end up putting it here. But if we're making it into new variables, if we're putting the information that we're creating into new places, we still get to look back at this and see what it was. And that's how I do some things like slew only, for instance, or noise shaping in dithering, is you do noise shaping by doing this and going like, okay, what do we need to do? We've made this into a quantized dithered output, and what would happen if we took this and subtracted what we started with? And you would end up with this tiny little speck of information that's what you would get when you started with this, did this stuff, got this result, and then subtracted what you started. If you didn't do very much here with small changes and subtracted this, it would take most of the sound away, and it would be what you would call like a null test of only this tiny remainder of the things that you actually did. And that's what noise shaping does, is noise shaping compares the end result dithered thing to where it started, and where it started was at a higher resolution level than the quantization that you've done. And this is ready to just go to a low resolution form. It's all ready to do it. And this started out as a more high resolution form, so there's more information in there. You can subtract it from your end result and get this small amount, which was the error being imparted by your system, and you put that back into the beginning again for your next sample or whatever. So yeah. So I'm still looking at some of these Banana Jack color schemes, because it seems to me we've got a bunch of available colors. And Bookla, see, the thing that's getting me about Bookla is I'm not sure that necessarily is very useful, because I get that audio outputs are CV outputs and they're all the same. So they're going to be using blue, green, or purple, but there is no type associated with those things. Instead, what they've got is blue is your CV outputs, and they're mostly about blue for outputs. Although Bug Brand, blue is a CV input, so that's kind of backwards. And green is a second channel of a CV output, like having velocity or something. And purple is a third channel of a output, And I'm sure that makes lots of sense within the context of the booklet that is doing this stuff. But that's not useful to what I'm talking about, because I'd like to be able to isolate different purposes to different colors so that you can see what these various things do. I'm going to have to work on that one a little more clearly. Although this is obviously the page I was looking for as far as the color schemes are concerned. And I see why they settled on black, red, white, red, black, red, white, green, blue, and yellow. We've got a company that apparently makes banana sockets, and they only sell them in those colors. So that's where those colors come from, is a company making that. Fair enough. That seems to work. So let me... If I can see myself in the camera, I'll be looking at myself talking with about 20-second delay, so that's distracting. So I don't use Isotope RX Elements Advanced for audio repair. I often don't really deal with the concept of audio repair at all. I try to get stuff the way I want it before it's sampled, because I don't trust doing much things to it within the digital domain. However, there is an exception. I've done some useful things with SoundHack. SoundHack has stuff going on where you can do spectral shaping, and I believe that's where Isotope does a lot of stuff. In particular, anybody doing noise reduction techniques is probably using spectral shaping. And my plugins don't tend to use spectral anything, but you can get that out of SoundHack, and it's a quite effective thing. You'd be doing stuff in that context, like taking a sample of the noise of a track and then applying the spectral noise reduction so that if any given band is below that threshold level, it goes quieter. And the secret to know about spectral noise reduction is you want to use it to minimize the noise rather than actually trying to remove it, because it'll get really ugly, weird, and twisted if you try to remove it. Doing a spectral noise complete gate and canceling it out completely only results in weird artificial sounding stuff, and the distracting and unpleasant quality of sounding like a bad cell phone reception is worse than the noise was. So you got to kind of balance it out. What you do is you set your thresholds so that they can cover the noise basically, and then you have it duck the various bands somewhat rather than just wiping them out completely. You take the bands down like 6 dB or 12 dB or so with the spectral shaping, rather than trying to take them down infinite dB. And doing that, you can get a reduced sense of the noise without replacing it with obnoxious other sounds. Gaussian low pass or high pass? Honestly, I'm not exactly sure what you mean. I do low passes and high passes, but in terms of a stream of samples, I'm not exactly sure how that would translate. Like, Gaussian noise is many noises layered upon themselves. If you do many low passes or high passes layered upon yourselves, you have a very different result. It's not Gaussian, instead it's just multipole. So it becomes steeper when you do that. It doesn't really change in another way. So why don't I live stream myself coding a plugin? Because it's boring as hell and I have to focus. That's probably the reason. I'm not saying that's impossible, or coding something anyhow. In fact, here, we're about 5 minutes from closing. Check it out. Bet you didn't know I had one of these in arm's reach. Here's something that I'm thinking about playing with. I have a Apple IIe. And I am thinking about trying to make this into a Eurorack module thing, where we've got a computer here. And this is kind of neat because these actually respond to keys being typed faster than modern computers, because it's just much simpler doing this kind of thing. But these have slots inside them, like this, for instance. And I don't really need to care very much about any of these cards because I'm probably not going to use them for what they are. The Apple II has slots, a whole bunch of slots that you can plug things into. I don't see why I couldn't come up with a way of making something like this that would go to Eurorack jacks. And what do you mean, poor Apple II? I've got it, so I'm going to do fun things with it. In theory, it should be possible to take these different connections and that go to the slots and write some kind of program where it's like, if there's a high voltage on this Eurorack jack, it's like a trigger, kind of like what we were talking about with the bookless and stuff. If this trigger input is high and the timing count is correct, then this output is also high. And it should be, Apple II will run in real time. So, and there's a lot of different spots on these slots that could conceivably do binary inputs and outputs. Also, since it's a computer, I don't know how it would react to analog voltages coming into or out of these things. I don't think I can do analog. Come on, yo. Plugging in the card. I don't know what that card does. I'm going to be taking these cards out later. Some of them I do know. For instance, this one says mouse interface. And this is a 80 column card, which I will not be needing to do because I'll be thinking more in terms of just the basic performance of the Apple II. And that's a 6502 chip. It starts out with just like integer AppleSoft Basic. And I know how to program that because that's how I started. And I'll probably be looking into programming it in an assembly language, and I can live stream that. And we'll patch it into the synthesizers, so every crazy thing I try to do in the assembly language programming, you'll hear it doing stuff with rhythms or notes or something, because it's also capable of making square wave outputs quite easily. And I'm pretty sure I can interface those signal voltages with Eurorack voltages. So it should be interesting. I'm quite looking forward to that because it's that or an Arduino or a Raspberry Pi, and it's like, yes, you can get a Raspberry Pi and you can have a little selection of slot-like outputs, and you could patch them into Eurorack things, and you could write Linux programs to address them, and all of that is certainly possible. But I have an Apple IIe. And that's just like raw transistors, just about. That is a much more primitive device, and it just amuses me greatly. Like, I would like to take this. I will do that, and then maybe drill holes in the top of this so that I can have a little screen there, and I can see what's going on. It doesn't have to be a big screen, because it's like 279 by 159 maximum resolution for the whole computer. That's it. And I remember that because I started out programming in the high-res mode. They make the letters out of that, and the reason they have to have a special board for being able to do lowercase letters is because there aren't enough pixels for lowercase letters normally. And 279 by 159, that's it. That's what you get. I think starting with 0. So 280 basically is the broadest dimension. This is like way sub-icon size. And the entire computer works on that. I think it would be adorable to have like a little tiny screen right there that's 279 by 159. It's a TV style screen, and just build it into the machine. And now the machine has its own screen, because nowadays you can do that. You can have very little power and have this little tiny screen built right there. And then up here, banks of Eurorack jacks. It would be so cool. That, or just it's got plenty of power, so I could build one of those insane pegboard sequencers with computers and audio generators on the top of this, and then also have the computer available to sequence and drive and control it, and it could be a sort of standalone, insane, circuit-bent techno monster machine. How cool would that be? I will answer it. That would be pretty freaking cool. So yeah, these are fun things. These are fun things to get into. But my first order of business beyond, I've got another plugin that's coming along. Since you're dialed in to my live stream, I haven't announced this to anybody yet, so I'll give you the preview. Most likely next week, you'll be getting a successor to DRes. Because what I'm going to do is do a version of DRes where, as it transitions the position, instead of having it go from the one spot to the other spot for just one sample, you get a voltage level that is the level just before it transitioned to the new spot. So essentially what it's going to do is it's going to be passing through raw audio that's unquantized to bridge the gap between the quantization positions. And that's going to cause it to be less high frequencies in the sort of square wavy quantized stuff. But it's also going to be an element of control that's going to bring stuff into a more natural sounding. I have high hopes for this. I think I can do it simultaneously on the quantization and the sample rate crunching. And the bottom line is, as soon as something changes from one quantized place to another, that's when I let through the raw sample for the previous one, because once I've done the transition, that means it's already past that point. So I need to use the previous one to get the intermediate position. And on really low frequencies, there will be very little difference between a completely quantized, completely smashed version. But the higher resolution you get, especially in terms of frequency response is concerned, the higher resolution you get, the more you're going to get this softening effect that's probably going to sound pretty it's probably going to sound pretty analog-y. It's probably going to sound more natural than just raw. Well, let me check out my latency. Up. Live chat is enabled. Slow mode is not enabled. And here's the advanced settings. Huh. Okay, well, that's interesting. I will address that next time. Currently, I have got no added delay, and I can't set any stream optimizations, but I think I'm probably on normal latency rather than ultra low latency. So, given that I'm having conversations with people, I think that's probably just as well that I might as well go to something with lower latency, so I will bear that in mind. We'll do this by next stream. It won't actually matter for the music stream, because the music stream I can't hear what anybody's saying anyhow. But I will go and attend to that as soon as the stream is over. It's not letting me change it now. I don't believe I'm going to need ultra low latency, although if conversation really gets lively, then I'll see whether I can get that going. It didn't seem necessary to me, but then at the same time, I guess the slight delay is getting old for people, so that's certainly something that I can do. I think maybe I had some kind of sense of not doing unnecessarily low latency was going to help me in some way, but maybe not. Maybe it's not going to. Also, just as a quick question before I go, because it's past 1 already, anybody on the Discord? Oh, yeah, it's not good. Okay, well, maybe try low. I'll see about that. Let me make a note for myself about that. I will do that, and then we'll see whether it works. And do I have anybody on the Discord? Specifically, do I have anybody on the Discord with voice chat available? In the absence of that, I will head off and probably take apart the Apple II some more. But it was fun showing that off because that's more likely to be that would be more interesting. Oh, Robert, are you on my Patreon? Because that's kind of what it's about. Let me see if I can find the information there. Da-da-dum. Also, in happy notes, I have cleared 500 patrons, so I might actually break into the top 50 of music on Patreon, which is pretty cool. I would like to see that. So, Discord, if you are on the Patreon, you should be added to the server. I'm also able to do invites and stuff, and that's what I'm doing when people are like, I'm not on the server, how do I do this? It's supposed to do it automatically. If it is not doing it automatically, drop me a direct message on Patreon, and I will get that set up this afternoon. For now, I think that the last concern about that was 5 days ago, and I think I set the guy up. So basically, that's what you should do, is jump on the Patreon if you need that straightened out. You will get the invite because I will send you the invite directly. It's those invites that last for a day, so if it doesn't work out, I'll send another. And that'll put you onto the Discord. And if you're doing some level of 3 plugins a year, 2 plugins a year, anything like that, I can set up the Discord to honor that. It doesn't give you anything special. There's just various chat rooms that are restricted to X number of plugins and over, and nobody actually uses them. It's just a bit of a joke. But it's possible that at some point I will I'll be doing some sort of gaming streams or something like that just to unwind, and I'll let people be part of that. And if you're one of those Discord users or on Patreon, or for that matter, I have people who are on TeamSpeak, so I'd probably be trying to run that too. You'd be able to not only join the, presumably Minecraft is what it would most likely be when I do it, but also chat on voice. So we will see how that develops. So far, it's still in the very early stages of figuring out what's going on. I have plans of doing something like that with White Sea Studios, the snake oil guy. He's kind of interested, but he might not have time for it. So that is still kind of unfolding. And lastly, I'm going to bid you good day. After demonstrating something that's going to be happening, which is I got flashing colored disco lights for the music stream. I'm not sure how obviously that shows up on the dashboard. Oh, there it is. So basically, next time I'm doing my music thing, I'm going to have shades up so that it'll be a little darker in here, and we're going to be Disco Madness, complete with a little strobe light that is patched into the envelopes of the kick drum synthesizer. And that one, it doesn't line up perfectly, but that just means that it flashes a little more sporadically. It probably will help people if they have issues with strobiness going on, that it's not a really fast, continuous thing, but it'll be trying to accentuate the kick. In any case, I believe that is about sufficient for the time being, and this is the first chance I've started to get a sense of what the crazy light show stuff is going to look like, even in a limited way. So that should be fun. I'm looking forward to that. And with that, I will talk to you guys next week. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.